very pleased to see that there's so many here still. And I just wanted to you to feel welcome to this webinar on the regional studies in the Nordic countries. I am Åsa Moberg. I'm head of library at the Nordic Africa Institute, and I will be moderating this webinar. Our institute, Nordic Africa Institute, celebrates 60th anniversary now in 2022. And we are very happy to be able to have this event together with Nordic Institute of Asian Studies. Our two institutes were both founded during the 60s when the interest for the developing countries were on the rise in the Nordics. We have had slightly different setups during the years, but the library components at both institutes have been very important for the outreach and support to Nordic students and researchers. So today I'm very pleased to be able to present a program where we combine perspectives of our respective region, but from both researchers, teachers, and librarians' views. Some practicalities: there is the possibility to pose questions via the Q&A function during the presentations. If there is a time issue, we will publish the answers afterwards in connection to the seminar webpage. So now I have the privilege to introduce my colleague, Professor Eleanor Fisher, Head of Research here at the Nordic Institute, for an introduction. So please, Eleanor, take the floor.
Thank you very much, Åsa, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today. When Åsa asked me to start this webinar by addressing the question of why does regional studies matter, it got me thinking, because somehow I assume, maybe take for granted, that regional studies does matter, but it isn't something I've necessarily tried to explain before, even to myself. Maybe I should start by saying, in case it isn't clear, because actually I had to think about it and look it up, what I think I mean by regional studies is knowledge relating to the societies, cultures, and intellectual output of countries within a specific region. Now, thinking about this question of why does regional studies matter, and also knowing this is a joint webinar between the Nordic Africa Institute and Nordic Institute of Asian Studies, made me reflect on my own career journey and why it has mattered to have regional studies collections within libraries where I have studied and worked, because my own scholarly background is in fact in both African studies and in Southeast Asian studies. I first went to university in 1987 at the University of Hull in Northern England. I arrived there to the grey, damp, cold of England from Zambia. I spent many hours in the library because it was the warmest place I could find. Perhaps I studied a little. The Library of Hull is renowned in the UK for having had a famous English poet, Philip Larkin, as one of the librarians in the past. But it is also renowned, or used to be, for its African and Southeast Asian studies collections. So people who are very specialised in these fields were attracted to the regional studies collections that were held by the library. Now, the University of Hull Library is in a multi-storey building, and depending on what essay I had to write, I used to alternate between the desks on the third floor, which was the African Studies collection, and the fourth floor, which was the Southeast Asian Studies collection, always looking out over the town and the North Sea. So speaking here today from the Nordic Africa Institute, where of course we have a wonderful regional studies library focusing on Africa, and I'm not biased, I wondered what message I would send back to myself in time as a young student, as I started out on my career journey, working on the third and fourth floors, surrounded by all these wonderful books on Africa and Asia that were grouped according to regional studies. What would I have to gain, and what should I value about regional studies collections over the next 30 years? I think there are 5 points that I could emphasise now. The first relates to access. Regional studies collections have given me access to materials and expertise in an interdisciplinary way that I haven't found amongst collections based on subjects or disciplines. The second relates to needs. And here I speak as someone who's been an individual learner, but also a lecturer, a department head, and a senior manager in a university, and now a head of research at the Nordic Africa Institute. Regional studies collections can be unique and distinctive, serving the needs of students and more mature scholars, and also attract people to them, which is what I'm very much privileged to sort of host people coming to the Nordic Africa Institute today. The third point that I would emphasize is around expertise, and it relates to the expertise and skills necessary to maintain such a collection, which I have benefited from in so many ways over the years. This involves an intimate understanding of the region by librarians in order to facilitate collection building, support the development of scholars such as myself, but also networks, and maintain expertise and cultural ties within the region in question, in our cases, Africa and Asia. And I see this expertise in action amongst my colleagues on a daily basis here at the Institute. The fourth point I'd make is technical, and I'm also far better equipped to explain it than me. There are obviously vast advances in the technology behind collections and in issues about publishing and access, which apply to any library. But there are also technical issues around bringing scholarship from the region to the notice of scholars working within the Nordics, which I feel is very, very important. And that has technical aspects to it that Kalle and also could very ably explain, and I'm not very equipped to. My fifth and final point is about engagement. I've been a beneficiary of how librarians and their colleagues responsible for regional studies collections has served as liaison points within my university and my institute in terms of collaborating in relation to research and to teaching activities in ways that are tremendously helpful to facilitate a focus on the area in question, and in ways that are interdisciplinary, which I feel is important. This has enhanced my own work as a student, a lecturer, and as a research leader. So with a very short answer to the question of why does regional studies matter, regional studies and regional studies library collections can provide accessible, engaging, and relevant resources about a region, bringing together vast knowledge and expertise in an interdisciplinary way that is of immense benefit to learning, to research, to teaching, and to engagement efforts. So I would send back the message to myself as a student sitting in the University of Hull Library, trying to keep warm amongst these wonderful regional collections, the value that these collections have and the expertise on which they are based, because speaking from experience, they can be the foundation of a career. Thank you very much. Also, can I hand back to you, please?
Thank you, Eleanor. Wonderful, an excellent introduction, really framing the kind of hour that we're going to spend today. I'm very happy that you were able to join us. And I can see there's no Q&A so far, so I will just let you know. When putting together this webinar, we wanted to have the kind of, different perspectives of regional studies, and also the researchers, teachers' perspectives. So we are joined here today by Professor Amanda Hammer from Center for African Studies at the University of Copenhagen, as well as Associate Professor Marie Højlund-Rosgaard from Department of Cross-Cultural and Regional Studies, also at the University of Copenhagen, to give us their perspective. I said to Amanda to pick her brain, but she didn't want me to go there. But anyway, it's a real pleasure now to invite you, Amanda, who's also a former NAI colleague, for you to share your perspectives this morning. So I turn over to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very, very much for inviting me. Hello to everybody, and hello to NAI colleagues, former and current. When also asked me to, when we had a conversation about this presentation, actually, the first thing that came to my mind was about the relationship between teachers, stroke supervisors. I'll leave the researcher part out because Eleanor has given this wonderful overview, which I relate to completely. So I've gone more to thinking about what is missing. And this is talking from someone who's at a Center of African Studies. We have a collection, a special collection, which since we moved buildings has gone way down deep into a basement. So it's almost like the opposite of the Nordic Africa Institute, this beautiful open space, these warm spaces to go to. Our library special collection has actually gone down into a basement, as well as things getting so, digitalized that there's less of the library feeling anymore. But let me share my screen. Whoopsie. And go to my slideshow. Can you all see this? I hope so. So what I've talked about is matchmaking librarians and teachers in African studies. I'm sorry about the wordiness on this, but I'm going to start by just talking about what are the assumptions about African studies in particular. And one thing that I want to say, particularly to librarians, I don't know how many other people are in this room, is that one important thing from an African studies perspective is there's a difference between studying Africa or something in Africa and African studies. So there are different things, different needs, which echo very much some of the things that Eleanor has said. So just to clarify, African studies is not just not only about the regions, the countries, the cultures, the economies, the politics, and so on. It's also an approach to thinking about Africa and the world, thinking about the world altogether, and it generates a set of critical, theoretical, methodological, and analytical practices. So these confront, as I say in the slide, historically grounded erasures, knowledge erasures, epistemological erasures, and structures of inequality and exclusion. So there's something, as Eleanor indicated, this is also about what's our relationship as scholars and students in the Nordic countries to scholars and students and people in Africa. So understanding those differences is quite important in terms of what it is we need from each other as teachers and librarians. I've got an overall query then for this little presentation, which is what kinds of things do we need to consider? What broad considerations, but also what practices, shifts in practices will enhance the provision of relevant, specialized and broader knowledge resources and hence enhance learning among African studies students. Again, Eleanor has given this beautiful introduction to what it meant for her, but I'm talking about the present day and talking from one particular center, although as somebody very engaged in European African studies and Nordic African studies, I'm aware of many other contexts. So some of the questions that I think questions are to start with, and again, these echo words and keywords that Eleanor has raised. So how common is it for librarians and library managers and those, on the other hand, developing curricula and teaching and supervising African studies students to directly engage with each other, to recognize each other's needs and contributions? So this is why I'm talking about matchmaking, because although there are fabulous librarians and there are fabulous teachers and researchers, I would say that they are still in different kind of silos to some extent, even though, relating to each other. So with the respective, what then are the respective priority concerns of librarians on the one hand and teachers, supervisors on the other? They're not the same, but they certainly can be and should be complementary. And then just these basic questions: what do teachers or supervisors need from librarians in order to support students? And vice versa, what do librarians need from teachers and supervisors to support the clientele, the users, students in this case, with focuses on students? I think part of just a platform for understanding that, I'm coming from the teacher, supervisor, researcher side, is to clarify then what these framing logics are for African studies. What are the specifics about African studies? And again, I'm not talking about just teaching about Africa. So of course, there's this distinction: teaching Africa, teaching African studies. we're confronted as teachers, as librarians, with this huge diversity of settings, of peoples, of themes, of questions, of visions. You know, what is it we're trying to achieve? Which constantly, this is the interdisciplinary nature, we're talking about both historical and contemporary contexts, with context always mattering. These are like catchwords, keywords: multiplicity, relationality, Africanist intersectionality, as I'm using this term, and always interdisciplinarity as a lens. So it's not simply about, you know, which country, which government, which state, which kinds of agriculture. It's always about trying to weave these things together. And lastly, very much in the forefront now is decoloniality, rethinking epistemologies, rethinking where sources of knowledge come from and how they're appreciated. So those are like fundamental to African studies. And clearly there are very different academic, research, teaching contexts that we have to confront. They're not all the same. We at CAS, we have had a library. It's not very active anymore. Nordic Africa Institute has this fantastic, enormous library, but the scales vary, the attention to, you know, these kinds of sources, collections vary enormously. At the same time, for those who don't work directly with students, and this is where the communication would be so important, is being able to show what kinds of students choose African studies. I'm not going to list what kinds they are, but these are questions to ask. They're very particular. They're different from those who choose sociology or history or so on. The particular kinds of interdisciplinary, I've already said this, and increasingly decolonial demands and expectations of African studies students and scholars have to be thought about. Very particular kinds of courses that African studies or other regional studies, you know, offer. These are not the same as just sort of either theoretical or thematic. They're very broad. And of course, there is the life cycle of students from BA, which we don't teach at CAS, MAs, PhDs. These are different stages and different relationships to knowledge and resources. And of course, we have to understand who the teachers and supervisors are in these fields and who specialized librarians are in these fields. I don't know how many minutes I've got left, but I think this is almost the second last. All right, so we have a lot of different kinds of challenges. I mean, when you're a student, I did sociology and African and Asian studies and then development studies. So of course, there are different kinds of requirements, needs. But one of the things I want to emphasize, the last point on theoretical as much as empirical African sources, the demands for us as students, researchers, but also for librarians, as Eleanor pointed out, is what are African sources? Making those much more visible, and not just as the empirical field material that we go and gather from, but as theoretical and philosophical sources. So these are some of the sort of knowledge challenges that I think there are. And again, there are this wide diversity of African studies centers, teaching spaces, research spaces. The scale varies, the funding available for collections, the staffing available to support that interchange between teachers and librarians. Okay, this is the last slide. So what are the implications then? For centers and staff teaching and supervising African studies students, we need to pay attention explicitly to the relationship between the curricula we develop, our pedagogical practices, of course, the needs of our students, but also the creative use of library sources through an educational life cycle. I think there's very little direct engagement between us or thinking directly about that. On the other hand, librarians and library managers, I think, need to be more proactive in reaching out to teaching staff working in African studies, clarify the changing needs, clarify, identify the complementary resources and possibilities for enhancing support to students. I just think there's many more opportunities to enhance through that. So finally, what's really the point of my matchmaking title is ensuring more direct communication and dialogue between teachers and teachers and librarians. So clarifying the changing academic needs and possibilities, sharing more curricular and topical themes and project-specific information, and finally, just occasionally identifying common strategic priorities between libraries and teachers. That's it.
Lovely, Amanda. Thank you. And you actually gave us a lesson for homework lesson to enhance the collaborations between teachers and librarians. So I'm very happy that you pointed that out, because we as a librarian, as a group, really need to know all kind of things to bring in, and you also need to know how we work with challenges when there are budgets, etc., to consider. But I think working together can solve so many things, so many challenges. But very much to reflect upon. Thank you, Amanda.
You're welcome.
Thank you for sharing. I'll check no Q&A so far. Let's see. It's now my privilege to invite a whole new region, the Asian Studies region, via Associate Professor Marie Höjler-Rosgaard. I'm very pleased that you were able to join us here. So we're almost covering the whole world now. So we have the Asia, we have the Africa as well. I'm really looking forward to your reflections, to where we can see the similarities and identify maybe the same challenges, but also some differences. So please, I invite you to take the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I will just share my screen. Yeah. So I'm representing the teacher view, and I have taught Japanese studies for more than 30 years now. So of course a lot of things have happened. Specifically, I think it also links to Amanda's idea of matchmaking between the supervisors and teachers and the librarians. But I am going to talk a lot about what students try to do and what does it seem to look like from my point of view when students go about the business of looking up materials. Now, I know many of my colleagues say that students don't like books anymore. I can tell you that rumor is very, very much an overstatement, because they actually love books, at least the ones that are involved in Asian studies, and I'm sure the same goes for African studies. So books are still something they really like, but sometimes they find it hard to find the relevant books, and that's what I'm going to talk about mostly. It'll be based, of course, on my experience with Japanese studies, but I think this is universal for many of the students dealing with the studies of regions like both of these two institutions do. So let's see if I can. Yeah. Okay, so first there's the question of how, what are good search words? I find students are amazingly narrow-minded when they search for things, and of course the photo is an overstatement, but not by much, I think, because if they decided to write about, what should I say, Japanese manga, which many of them do, then they search only for that and not for similar phrases that could cover other things. So they focus very narrowly, I think. They fail to think of the related topics. There's also the question of language. If you search only in English, of course, that's what you're going to get. But since our students need also to use material in Japanese, they actually have to search in Japanese as well. And they have to not just use the transliterations, but they have to search with the appropriate characters. And this is certainly something that my students are often quite surprised by, the difference it makes that you actually put in the characters. lots of wonderful materials can come out of that. And the last, of course, it's about also, it relates to the search words. It's being imaginative. Who could have written about this? What other words could be used in other parts of the world to cover what I'm looking for? And then there's the where do I search? As you probably know, Google reigns supreme. But even so, most of my students do not know how to use it like a pro. So they use it, but they don't get enough out of it, I think. And that is even more so for Google Scholar. Most of them only realize that Google Scholar exists when I tell them. And this is when they're in their second year. So I think a lot of precious time is getting lost there. They also sometimes appear to find searching libraries online quite a daunting task, especially when there are different categories of materials. Why is it in monographs and journals and so on, and what's the difference between the materials? How do I search in an effective way? So it takes time for them to acquaint themselves with what you could call the topography of the library search engines. Databases, what bases? They think mostly of military bases, I'm afraid, but so it's usually, they usually ignore them because they don't know what they can get out of them, and they certainly ignore those in the countries they study, which is quite quite unfortunate, because I mean, in Japanese studies, they have huge collections of all sorts of things. They're very good at registering. And if you think about China, for example, Google does not really do the trick because the Chinese are not into Google. So there's also this whole idea of questioning the search engines you're using. Google tends to learn from your previous searches, so that sort of limits what you can actually find. Which leads me on to what to use, what are valid sources, and it's all about, I suppose, information literacy, but also about verifying and confirming your information. How do I find out if a source is valid? How do I find out if it's fake information, for example? And how do I handle sources with an agenda? Because many of the sources, they will come and have an agenda that could be political, but it could also be more sinister agendas. So verification is very important. One of the things that seems to be extremely confusing these years is this idea of primary and secondary sources. I think it's one of the questions I answer most often, and of course I'm not a very satisfying person to answer that, because I usually tell them it depends on how you use the material. So lately, our board of study has decided to throw in a further complication, namely empirical material. So now we have total confusion. And that, of course, also is exported over into the search activities. And the art of referencing. Usually when we get the students, they think it looks awful with all of these parentheses in the text, and they think they think it looks like they cannot think for themselves if they put in the references all the time. So what I've started to do is to, of course, they have to put in the references, otherwise they are dead, but they can also use the list of references for inspiration for their searches. What did this person who wrote this wonderful article, which I'm going to quote until I'm blue in the face, what did he or she actually use to reach that point? Is there any inspiration there? Any new search words, perhaps? Or any new writers that I could consult with? So let's see. So there's the thinking out of the box and around the topic is very difficult, because they want to focus. They're interested in this topic, and being creative with it is difficult. I also find they give up quite easily if Google fails to turn up with anything. And Google often fails because they search so specifically, and then they give up otherwise good topics because of lack of imagination, I would say, as to where data might be. For example, when I show them the Japanese Ministry of Education's homepage, they're amazed at the kinds of things you can find. They have statistics, they have guidelines, they have teaching materials, they have links. Of course, they also have policies, but there's so much to get out of it, and that goes for organizations too. Of course, they have their own backlog of archives, and I think that's really one of the things they are not often aware of. So the more we can show them how to handle this, because the problem, of course, also is these would typically be sources with an agenda. So how do I treat these sources with care, with the necessary care? And that is when ask for help. Ask for help, not just at home. I think co-students are one of the most underused sources. And I keep telling my students that the biggest asset in this room is sitting right next to you, because they help each other searching. They give each other tips if they know that comrades are looking for specific materials. Sometimes when they stumble over it, then they remember that my friend was looking into this. So I think that's a resource that's really, really important. They also underuse, most of them underuse the supervisors, I have to say, and especially the librarians. Now I know that you are often few in number. So if you are inundated with students all the time, then of course it would be difficult. But I promise you, it's not going to happen, unfortunately, because very few students will do that. But then my hope is that these students will tell their co-students that, this actually worked, and you can do it like this. Then you will find what you need. I often hear that they find a title or something that they want to see, and it's not in the library. So I give up. And this is when I would love to see them say, okay, I asked the librarian, because they don't know. They don't know that, for example, Amanda was talking about how the library is now locked away in the basement. And much the same has happened for our collections, of course. So you cannot just browse, and if it's not out in the open, it's difficult to figure out how to get it. And they very rarely think about asking the librarian. Or if they say this is in a far away place, then maybe it's impossible. Acquisition, you can actually ask the librarians about acquisitions. Now that is really a novelty to most of them. So I think there's a lot for all of us to do, and that's why I really like Amanda's idea about matchmaking, because this is, of course, it's about making sure that we have the materials available that we need for our courses, but it's also about coaching students so they know how to go about their business when they want to acquire material that maybe is far away, or they want to access to materials that are for some reason or other under lock and key. They do not understand the resource of the librarian, and that's going to be my final words to you. Please blow your trumpets more and let them know that there's a wonderful resource here that actually does help a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie, so much. I really love the idea of blowing our trumpet. Both Amanda, you pointed to the kind of communication that you need between our different professions in order to serve and to help the students. And I know that several users surveys how the students go about finding information material actually takes up what kind of sources they use for the information. So the first one is, as you said, the fellow student, they ask them. But actually one of the main drivers towards the library is actually when the teacher advises their students to go to the library. So I think we could blow the trumpet and build an orchestra together. Really.
Yes, let's.
And it's very interesting also to see the kind of challenges and similarities that we have between regions. Amanda mentioned working with the curricula and also to, you know, to find the kind of decolonized material, etc. And you also talked about helping the students find their way to relevant material. So I think there is a lot to be done here, and also to avoid or also use the kind of good enough stuff that's out there on Google, because that's the problem or the blessing in disguise. Because if you really want to get to those relevant sources, you also have to advise and learn how to use the other channels for information. I'm very pleased that you were able to highlight things that we recognize, but that we also think that might get our thoughts going now. So thank you, Marie, and thank you, Amanda. I can see no Q&A so far. I think maybe people have been overwhelmed by your presentations. But anyway, now I will go over to the library presentations. It will be me and my colleague Kalle who will start with the presentation of the Nordic Africa Institute Library. Now, very short, this year we are celebrating the 60th anniversary, but we have also begun to implement our new 5-year strategy. And this is actually where you can see the kind of dialogue that you have asked for displayed, because our 3 core activities, researchers, communicators, and librarians, we intermingle these three spheres. The library component of the Institute both supports and builds bridges between different perspectives, decolonized perspectives, by providing content from the north and the south, but also by providing robust channels for dissemination of metadata. I will give you a quick tour of the library and a focus, and then Kalle will continue with the digital resources that we have. Now, this is the reading room at the Nordic Africa Institute. We have a very large physical library with interlibrary loan services for all the 5 countries. The main entrance to our collection and services for distance users is, of course, through the web page or through the search portals where we are present. Our focus in modern Africa after the Second World War, social sciences, so we cover the whole continent, or North Africa is also present in the collection. When we talk about social sciences, we also include expressions of society like fiction, art, and humanities, because we want to provide different aspects in order to facilitate the study of a society. Our plus 85,000 titles are unique in the Nordic context. We provide content from North and South. As the core of the Institute activities now with the new strategy is to bring in the African perspective. So a third of our titles are actually published on the continent. And this part contributes heavily to the uniqueness of our resources. The African studies as a field is turning digitally as all other social science subjects, but there is still very much content that is still published in print, and I know that goes for the Asian studies as well. But it's really true for the African generated knowledge. The e-content from Africa is on the rise, but it can still be immature or lack features like proper metadata or proper long-term archiving. And this actually blocks integration in the kind of formal structure of information. And it's also one of the reasons too why the Africa-produced knowledge is less represented in the knowledge bases that are behind the kind of library discovery systems that we are all using. Now, apart from our academic collection, I want to highlight 2 special collections or features of us. modern African fiction. All countries are represented, and we know that this collection is especially popular among our Danish users. Official documents. I was very happy to hear, Marie, that you mentioned the ministries. We have the primary sources from the African governmental bodies. It's very scattered for some countries, whereas for other countries you have long series of publications. But this material is, of course, turning increasingly available online, but with short-term presence, and also difficult to find in some cases as government shifts, but also as ministers shifts, when they shift the kind of subject between different ministers. But we are there for you, for helping find. The Nordic Africa Institute, as a Nordic library, we navigate 5 different national library infrastructures, but our service package for all countries are the same, but the level of usage differs according to how well we are integrated into the national structures. Common for all countries are the kind of digital services that we provide through Zoom, email, or through the digital collection, which now I'm going to hand over to you, Kalle, so you can continue with our digital sources. Please, Kalle.
Thank you, Åsa, and thanks also to the previous speakers for really good reflections, confirming things we kind of know already, but also new aspects to take into consideration. I'm going now to share my screen here to show you a few highlights relevant in this context. Åsa ended with an overview over the Institute website, and I'm here now somewhat down into our library page structure. Because if it's one thing we want you to remember and bring along here now, it's this, our remote access services. As most libraries, it's only on site we can offer our most complete services. But the past few years, we have been able to negotiate and make agreements with some publishers to be able to make resources accessible for our target group spread out in the Nordic countries remotely. In short, if you're a student or a researcher with a current affiliation to a higher educational institution in any of the Nordic countries, you are eligible to apply. And more concretely, we consider you eligible if you have a valid email address with the institution, and that's where we send the info needed, usually within a few days. I'm not going to present all of this in detail, but just give you a brief overview here now, kind of material-wise. First of all, news and newspapers. We've seen an increased interest in those as source materials. And we're glad to be able to offer African News Agency and SA Media, providing articles several decades back with a Southern African focus, but also more. And coming soon, we have All Africa, a news aggregator covering the whole continent. Recent years are free to anyone, but our subscription gives access to the archives as well. When it comes to books, we have the African Writers series, providing a few hundred fiction classics. And we also have the African Digital Bookstore, which is a Senegal-based resource with English and French titles. We subscribe to 2 of their sub-collections. From Oxford, we have what you could call reference resources, a few specific subject areas of their research encyclopedia and bibliographies. And these provide peer-reviewed articles on different topics. They are regularly updated and include tips on further reading. Journal-wise, we have a few titles from Cairn, with many of them are Francophone focus. And we hope to be able to offer even more journals in the future. There's also the more general Africa-wide information database, pulling in relevant resources or references from different sources on many topics. Currently, this page is the one-stop shop for all these remote access information, with a short presentation, the links, and the application form. So I urge you to have a closer look at this. Now I'm going to move over to our countries and regions pages. We know that many of our library users have a country focus, geographic focus, and these pages can give those persons an excellent starting point, presenting our institute's combined resources on that specific country. And I'm going to use the South Africa here as an example, this page. So first of all, we have our own researchers, we have our news items, we have publications from our institute presented here, the most recent projects, and then we come to the resources from the library. And these are basically ready-made links to our collections and resources, wider and narrower searches, direct search to titles published in the country, links to our link collection and sister institutions and so forth. And all of this is pretty much repeated in the same manner for each country. A few of these links lead to our main search tool called AfricaLit Plus. I'm going to click one of those. And this is in a way like any search tool you'd find at a university or a research institute, making the catalog and subscribed e-journals, etc. searchable. But the difference is, of course, our scope, our Africa focus. And this search tool could be used or usable in a few different ways. You can find relevant print titles to borrow in person or through interlibrary loans. You can find relevant open access titles in full text available from anywhere. You can find relevant titles we possibly cannot offer remotely, but they are still useful as references. So in a wider sense, you could say that, or you could see our search tool as an Africa-focused reference database, which we constantly try to tweak to be as broad as possible within our well-defined scope. So finally, one last thing here now. Switching to another page here. One challenge here is, of course, how do we reach this dispersed target group of ours in the Nordics? Or even better, how can subject specialists, librarians, and others out there inform on their part? Well, if you have the means to influence the contents on your websites and subject guides, we've made some ready-made text snippets about our resources and offerings that you could just copy and paste or use them as a basis for your own texts. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Carl. It was a very quick tour of our main resources, but we are there just an email away, so don't hesitate to contact us. Now I'll talk very quick here. I'm going to invite Inga-Lill to present the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies, our sister institute, I can say. So Inga-Lill Blomqvist, I was so happy that you wanted to join me on this adventure in co-arranging the event. But now I'll leave the floor open to you. Please go ahead, Inga-Lill.
Thank you. I'll start by sharing my screen. And first of all, I must say I'm very impressed with what you're doing in the Africa Institute Library. NIAS Library has had a very different recent development in the last decades and is working on a very different scale. Let's see. First of all, very briefly about Asian studies in the Nordic countries. Well, first of all, we don't have a clear geographical boundary for Asian studies in the same way as you have for Africa. But at NIAS, we've defined Asia as Central Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Oceania. And of course, there has been a growing increase in research in Asia, and especially East Asia since the 90s, and which can also be reflected in the book collections in the different university libraries and research libraries when it comes to Western material on Asia. There's also graduate programs for Chinese, Japanese, and Korean studies in several universities and on different levels. And while there has been a strong tradition for Southeast Asian studies and South Asian studies, some language programs there have been cancelled in the last decades. And research is to a large degree focused on developments in contemporary Asia nowadays. And it is increasingly based in social sciences and cross-disciplinary studies, of course. And there's also been a growing number of research collaborations with Asian partners on different levels and in different disciplines. But NIAS, then, the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies, we are a research institute, and we focus on modern and contemporary Asia from a social sciences and cross-disciplinary focus. But we also provide some services to support Nordic research on Asia, with research dissemination and networking, but we also have a scholarship program for MA and PhD students. We have a publishing house, an international publishing house, NIAS Press, and we have the library. And we're mainly funded by Nordic funding, previously from the Nordic Council of Ministers and now from Nordforsk. We have what we call the NNC, the Nordic NIAS Council Partner Institutions. This is a collaborative network consisting of Nordic universities and research institutes with a strong interest in research on Asia. The NNC memberships are annually based and require a membership fee to NIAS. And then the NNC institutions receive some special benefits, mainly library services. The NIAS library is a special library like the Africa Institute Library, and provide complementary services to universities and research libraries in the Nordic countries. We nowadays provide access to special EResources for modern and contemporary Asia from a mainly social sciences and cross-disciplinary focus then. We have a slightly different history from the Africa Institute, as we had a division of labor previously where NIAS library collected material for books and journals in Western languages, while the university and the Royal Library here in Denmark collected material in Asian languages and more on the humanities than NIAS. But when the NNC was formed, we were requested if we could subscribe to Asian language EResources for the member institutions, because the number of users in each institutions are small, so it made sense to work on a Nordic level there. So we started started a collection. Then in 2014, NIAS got a very serious budget cut, and we actually had to discontinue our printed collections that were transferred to the university library here. So NIAS library became a 100% digital library, providing EResources for Nordic users in general, but for the NNC institutions in particular. We have a platform called the asiaportal.info, where we try to provide all our services. And the portal has two purposes. One is to provide these information resources for the users in the Nordic countries, and the other one is to promote and disseminate Nordic research on Asia, which we do in the Nordic Perspective sections, where we present news and events from the Nordic region. We have introductions to special collections in Nordic libraries and museums. And in the Nordic Asia Online section, we have webinars and podcasts and blog from Nordic institutions. The EResources collection consists of databases, ebooks, and journals. And you can browse and search the collection for specific EResources, but we don't have a library catalog or a discovery system, so you can't do cross-database searches for content, and you have to search each database separately. So what do we have? We have about 380 EResources in total, of which 156 is databases, which could also mean websites with lots of information. And about 40 of these are licensed for NNC only. And this is mainly, but not exclusively, databases with materials in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. And then we have about, or more than 140 books from NIAS Press that are also only available in full text for the NSC institutions, and a small collection of free journals. We don't often buy, or we often, most of the time, cannot buy EResources from international companies in English because they're usually too expensive to acquire for 22 institutions with so many potential users. We have a limited budget. So what do we have? We have for China, for example, for the license databases, we have a number of EResources from mainland China and mainly in Chinese, covering academic journals, newspapers, legal information, statistical data, and etc. For Japan, we also have quite a good collection we have for what is available. We have one reference work database, and we have several of the newspaper archives. And then we can also provide ebooks in Japanese. For Taiwan, we have resources that we acquired through a collaboration with the National Central Library in Taiwan, which provide them for free for us. And for Korea, we have 2 of the academic journals databases that we share with 5 Nordic institutions or NSC institutions. And then we have a database that provides news and data from North Korea. Oh, sorry, what happened? Can you see it still? Okay. For South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia, there isn't that many resources basically in local languages which we can acquire. So for South Asia, we have 1 newspaper database or archive, and for Southeast Asia, we have an ebooks collection. For Central Asia, we haven't been able to find anything that is licensed, that we can buy. And then we have 2 sort of more general databases, Bibliography of Asian Studies and Press Reader, which you know is newspapers and magazines from all over the world. The administration of the whole EResources collection and the Asia portal is handled all by NIAS Library. We sign the licenses and we pay for them, and it's all paid by NIAS general finances, consisting mainly of our Nordic funding, and to a smaller part by the NSC membership fees, as well as some external funding. So the Nordic funding is extremely important for the NSC cooperation here, because the NSC membership fees are low and thus actually not cover the costs for the services or even for the licenses themselves. So, but we have contact librarians in all the NSC institutions that we work together with in what we call the NSC Library Group. And we together do an evaluation and selection of EResources as much as possible with our NSC colleagues who also do the outreach to the users very much. And I rely heavily on my NSC colleagues for knowledge in the Japanese and Korean EResources. So this kind of cooperation is a bit different, unusual. It has some main advantages. One is that through the NSC memberships, the researchers and students can actually get access to a whole collection of EResources. We don't think that any of even the bigger university libraries will be able to acquire all of these EResources themselves. And it's important that because we have this Nordic funding, we and can keep the NSC membership fees down, we can provide access to this collection for institutions of different sizes, also for smaller research institutes, or that maybe only have 2 to 3 researchers that need this material, but for which it's crucial, and it's crucial for them to have access to resources from the whole, for example, East Asia region. So, and because we are handling the licenses and provide one access point, we can keep the prices down. And then by cooperating with our contact librarians, we can use our combined subject expertise and networks to help researchers and students better. And together we can also apply for funding based on that we are a Nordic corporation. But of course, there's limitations. I mean, the biggest limitation is that we are so dependent on Nordic funding. And that also means that we have a flat, limited annual budget that doesn't really work well with price rises. And it's also very difficult when you reach the level of the budget to further develop the collection. And because the budget is limited, we cannot buy archival rights to all the resources. Sometimes it's not available, but even if it is, we couldn't afford it for 22 institutions. Then I want to go over to some general issues for Asian studies collections in general. As we all know, the cost for EResources is growing, and we hear about budget cuts from our member institutions. And that seems to a large degree influence the printed collections with ubiquitous programs for patron-driven acquisitions. And this, of course, means that it's very difficult to have a stable collection building for Asian studies. Also, this heavy reliance on EResources is problematic, especially for Asian material and probably also for African materials, because there is so much material that is actually not available in digital format still. And EResources also are unreliable. The coverage may not be complete because of technical or copyright reasons or sensitivity of subjects, and material can disappear, can be moved to another database or just totally taken out. And this reliance on EResources also diminishes the possibilities for interlibrary loans, which are so important for specialized areas as Asian language materials. And to build these collections also requires librarians with area expertise and languages skills. But that also, from what we see, is there are less and less of that in the Nordic countries and in Europe in general. There are exceptions, but in general, it's a difficult situation. Another big issue that we can see is the need for text and data mining rights. It's growing as younger researchers are being trained to use these tools in their research. And of course, for Europe, you have the European Copyright Directive, which provides a general formulation for data mining rights. But we are negotiating with providers in Asia where the copyright situation is totally different. And even if you can get text and data mining rights, my experience is that they can be very severely limited in how you can use it. And you might also be required to acquire permanent access rights or even getting hosting rights for the raw data to store it and make it searchable, which is something that we cannot do in our small library. And then, of course, there is this very limited amount of EResources in Asian languages from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. We do what we can to find free resources, but and open access publications. But of course, open access publishing in social science and humanities are limited also in Asia. And then finally, after 50 years or more than 50 years, NIAS is facing a very uncertain future, as it seems that we will not, very likely that we will not be able to continue to get Nordic institutional funding after 2024. So now we're trying to find an alternative solution for access to these licensed resources that are so crucial actually for researchers and students. But without Nordic funding, the cost will most likely rise substantially for the participating institutions, which could result in that smaller institutions with smaller budgets and fewer users actually cannot afford to continue to have access to the collection. And of course, it can also influence the size of the collection. And as we have seen, the printed collections are not really an alternative to this EResources. So it's a problematic situation for NIAS and for this collection for the future. Yeah, that was it.
Thank you. Thank you, Inga-Lill. It's very interesting to see how you work with the challenges that you have at NIAS. And we know that there is an interest for the kind of regional material that we have now. I think I will be wrapping up now because I see that we have been slightly over time here. But there have been no questions so far at the Q&A. But I can say that I'm so pleased that we were able to join forces and to do this together, because I could see all kinds of perspectives coming in regarding regional studies, and also that there is a need for closer cooperation between teachers, supervisors, researchers, and librarians in order to help and guide people to find the resources that they need. Because we as the librarians working at the special library with special library collections like NAI and like NIAS, we know that the kind of resources that are just one click away suits your studies and challenges. But we also know that the kind of resources that might be 2 clicks away or 3 clicks away actually might add quality to your studies and quality to your resources. But thank you, everyone. And thank you, some 35 plus participants who has been participating this morning. So I thank you all the speakers for your contributions, and also for the participants taking your time to listen to us this morning. And then I also want to end with that, please don't forget to contact us at the Nordic Africa Institute or the Nordic Institute for Asian Studies through the library contacts. If you have any further questions, or if you have any suggestions how we can work more closely together. So with these words, I hope that we will be ending for a pleasant lunch maybe this morning. Thank you and goodbye.